He had always preferred to travel quietly. No motorcade, no flashing lights, no security entourage. Just a man in a plain gray jacket, blending in with everyone else at the airport. After years in government service, he had learned that the best way to see the truth of a place was to move unseen through it. He had just returned from a national security meeting in another city. It had been a long week, long talks, tight schedules, endless briefings. The meeting had gone well, but his body was tired. As the early morning sun poured through the wide glass windows of the small regional airport, he took a slow breath and pulled his suitcase closer. He moved like anyone else, calm, patient, ordinary. The air smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, the hum of announcements filling the terminal. Travelers rushed by with luggage wheels clicking on the floor. A group of kids laughed near a fast food counter. It was just another day, another flight, another stop. He found a seat near the baggage claim carousel and checked his phone. A few new messages had come in. Updates from Washington, a note from his assistant about an upcoming press conference. He read them quickly, then put his phone away. He didn't want to think about work now. For a few hours, he was just another traveler waiting for his bag. When the conveyor belt started moving, he stood up, adjusting his jacket. The crowd around him grew dense. People leaned forward, eager to grab their luggage before anyone else. He smiled faintly at their impatience. Years of fieldwork had trained him to observe, not rush. He watched faces, movements, body language, habits that never left him even outside the office. A large black suitcase rolled by, followed by two smaller ones. His wasn't there yet. He stepped back a little to give space to an older woman struggling to lift her bag. She thanked him with a nod. He replied softly, "No problem at all," and returned to watching the belt. That's when he noticed two uniformed police officers standing near the exit. They looked young, maybe in their 30s. One was tall and heavyset, the other lean with sharp eyes. They seemed to be scanning the crowd, their gaze landing briefly on each person before moving on. At first, he thought nothing of it. Airport police often kept an eye on things. But after a few minutes, he felt their eyes rest on him longer than usual. He didn't look away. Years of interrogation experience had taught him that holding eye contact calmly often unsettled those who watched too closely. The taller officer nudged his partner and whispered something. The leaner one nodded. He sighed quietly. He'd seen that look before, the kind that didn't come from curiosity but from judgment. Maybe it was the plainclothes, maybe the travel-worn face, or maybe something deeper. Whatever it was, he knew where it was heading. He picked up his suitcase when it finally appeared and started walking toward the exit. The crowd thinned as people dispersed, greeting relatives or calling taxis. The officers moved closer. Their pace matched his. He could almost time it, 3, 2, 1, and then came the voice, "Excuse me, sir." He stopped and turned. "Yes?" The tall officer gave a tight smile.
"Can we see some identification?"
He raised an eyebrow. "Identification? May I ask what this is about?" "Just routine," said the leaner one. "You were acting suspicious near the baggage area." He looked genuinely surprised. "Suspicious? I was waiting for my suitcase. Mind showing us your ID?" The tall one pressed. He reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Inside was his government identification, the kind that usually ended all questions. But he paused for a moment. Over the years, he had learned something important. How people act when they think you're powerless says more about them than anything else. He wanted to see how far this would go. He instead handed over his driver's license. The officer took it and looked it over with narrowed eyes. "You from around here?" The tall one asked. "No," he said evenly. "I'm here for work." "What kind of work?" He smiled faintly. "Federal," the leaner officer smirked. "Federal, huh? You mean like IRS?" "Something like that," he replied calmly. The officers exchanged glances again. The taller one's tone hardened. "Sir, do you have any other identification? Something that proves where you work?" He looked at them, then at the people passing by. A few travelers had started watching from a distance, curious about the scene. The man adjusted his jacket and said, "I think my license is enough, isn't it?" The lean officer stepped closer. "Not if you're being uncooperative." He didn't flinch. "I'm not being uncooperative. I'm answering your questions." "Then you won't mind us checking your bag," said the taller one, gesturing toward the suitcase. He paused. "Do you have a reason to search it?" "Like I said, a routine," he sighed. "You keep using that word?" What word? Routine. Usually means you don't have a reason. That seemed to irritate them. The tall one's voice rose slightly. Look, sir, we can make this easy or hard. He met the officer's gaze. I'd prefer easy. Then opened the bag. The crowd nearby grew silent. A young couple stopped mid-stride, whispering. Someone took out a phone discreetly, filming. The man noticed but didn't react. He opened his suitcase slowly, revealing neatly folded clothes, files, and a small toiletry bag. Nothing more. Nothing less. The officers looked disappointed, as if they had expected something explosive. The lean one kicked the edge of the bag lightly. You travel light for someone on federal business. He kept his tone calm. I'm efficient. The taller officer crossed his arms. All right. We'll just need to run your name. He nodded slightly. Go ahead. They stepped aside, radioing in his name. He could hear snippets of the exchange. Code numbers, pauses, confusion on the other end. They repeated his name twice, then a longer silence. The lean one frowned, clearly not getting the answer he wanted. After a moment, the taller one came back. Says here there's no local record of your employment. He gave a patient smile. I don't work locally. Then where? The leaner one asked sharply. Washington. That seemed to unsettle them a little, but they pressed on. You expect us to believe that? The tall one said. He simply looked at him. I don't expect anything. The taller officer shifted uncomfortably. For a brief second, the man could see doubt flicker in his eyes. That uneasy feeling when authority senses it might have overstepped. The leaner one stepped closer again, lowering his voice. What are you really doing here? He held the man's stare. Trying to get home. The officer hesitated as if unsure what to do next. Then, trying to regain control, he said loudly, Sir, we're going to ask you to come with us for further questioning. The man stayed still. Am I being detained? The officer blinked. It's just a quick talk. Am I being detained? He repeated, his tone calm but firm. The tall one answered after a pause. Yes, for now. The man took a slow breath, nodded and said quietly, Then I'll cooperate. He closed his suitcase, locked it, and followed them toward the security office. As they walked, people whispered. Some looked angry, others confused. A child tugged his mother's sleeve, asking what was happening. She didn't answer. The air in the terminal felt heavier now, charged with quiet tension. Inside the small security room, the man sat in a metal chair while one officer typed on a computer and the other stood by the door. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. He watched them calmly, hands resting on his knees. The lean officer asked again, You sure you don't have any other ID? He reached into his jacket pocket slowly, pulling out a small leather case. He placed it on the table but didn't open it. Are you sure you want to see this? The officer frowned. What's that supposed to mean? He gave a faint smile. You'll see. Before they could respond, the door opened. A middle-aged woman in an airport security uniform entered, holding a clipboard. She looked surprised to see the man sitting there. Wait, she said, her eyes widening. What's going on here? The officers turned. Just questioning, ma'am, said the tall one. Routine check. The woman stepped closer, squinting at the man's face, and then froze. Oh my God, she whispered. Do you know who this is? The two officers exchanged confused looks. Who? The lean one asked. She looked directly at them. That's the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The room went dead silent. Even the hum of the light seemed to fade. The officers turned pale, realizing what she had said. The man sat quietly, expression unreadable. The taller one stammered, Sir, we were just... He raised a hand gently, stopping him. Let's not make a scene. I'm fine. The woman looked furious. You detained the director? The lean officer's mouth opened, then closed again. We didn't know. He stood slowly, closing the leather case and slipping it back into his jacket. That's enough, he said softly. I think I've seen what I needed to. Neither officer moved. Their hands shook slightly, the weight of realization settling on them. The man adjusted his jacket, picked up his suitcase, and walked toward the door. As he passed the woman, he gave her a polite nod. Thank you, he said quietly. She nodded, still in disbelief. He stepped out into the terminal again, the morning sun spilling across the floor. People were still watching, some with phones raised. He didn't look at them. He just kept walking, each step calm and measured. No anger, no raised voice, just silence. the kind that carried more power than shouting ever could. And as he reached the exit, one thought crossed his mind. Sometimes the lesson people need most is the one they give themselves. The news had spread through the airport faster than anyone expected. Within minutes, security officers, airport staff, and even passengers were whispering about what had just happened, how 2 local officers had detained someone they should never have touched. But the man himself didn't react like most people would have. He didn't shout, didn't complain, didn't demand an apology. He just kept walking toward the quiet area near the exit, suitcase rolling softly behind him. His calmness seemed almost strange in the middle of all that noise. He stopped by a large glass window and looked out at the runway. The morning sun was brighter now, reflecting off the metal wings of parked planes. He could see workers loading luggage and fueling jets moving with practiced rhythm. The world outside continued as if nothing had happened. Inside, though, the air still carried tension. A security officer approached him carefully. "Sir," she said softly, "would you like a private area to wait? I'm so sorry for what happened." "We didn't know." He shook his head. "No need, I'll wait here. I have some time before my next flight." The woman nodded, clearly nervous. "Of course, sir. If you need anything, I'm fine," he said gently. She gave a respectful nod and left, whispering something into her radio as she walked away. He stood there for a long moment, watching a plane lift into the sky. He had seen this kind of misunderstanding before, not just at airports, but everywhere. Years of working in law enforcement had taught him how quickly judgment could turn into action, and how easily authority could blind people to respect. He wasn't angry, not really. He was more thoughtful. He wondered what those 2 officers were feeling now in that small security room. Shame probably, fear too, but maybe also realization, the kind that stays with you for the rest of your life. He decided to give them that chance. He turned and walked back toward the security office. The woman from earlier saw him coming and looked startled. "Sir, you don't have to go back there," she said quickly. "I know," he replied, "but I want to." When he entered the room again, the 2 officers were still there. Their faces told everything, pale, nervous, full of regret. The taller one stood up immediately. "Sir, please, we're so sorry." "We didn't realize," he raised a hand calmly. "Please sit." They hesitated, then obeyed. He set his suitcase down and looked at them quietly. The silence made them even more uncomfortable. "I'm not here to humiliate you," he said finally. "I just want to understand something." The lean officer swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." "When you saw me at baggage claim," the man continued, "what made you decide to approach me?" The tall officer looked at the floor. "You looked different, sir. You weren't acting like the others, just standing there watching everyone." He tilted his head slightly. "Watching everyone." And that seemed suspicious. The officer nodded slowly. "At the time, yes." The man folded his hands. "And when I cooperated, when I answered your questions, when I showed you my ID, why didn't that end it?" The lean officer sighed. "We thought maybe it was fake." "Because?" he asked quietly. Neither spoke. The silence grew heavier. Finally, the taller one muttered, "We made a mistake, sir. A big one." He looked at them for a long moment. "Yes," he said softly. "You did." Both men lowered their heads. "But mistakes," he added, "can teach more than any training manual." The taller officer looked up, surprised. "Sir, we didn't mean any harm." "I know," the man said, cutting him off gently. "But harm doesn't always come from intent. It comes from assumption, and assumption comes from fear." They both looked uneasy, unsure how to respond. He stood and walked slowly around the small room, stopping by the window. "Do you know what I do for a living?" They nodded weakly. "Then you also know," he continued, "that I've met hundreds of officers like you, men and women trying to do their job, trying to keep people safe. But I've also seen how easily good people can lose sight of what their badge means." He turned back toward them. "That badge doesn't just give you power. It gives you responsibility, to protect, to respect, and to think before you act." The lean officer's voice cracked slightly. "We understand, sir," he nodded. "I hope you do. Because the next person you stop might not be as patient as I am, and next time it could go very differently." They both nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. The man walked over, placed a hand lightly on the table, and said, "I'm not filing a report. I'm not making a public scene. But I will be sending a note to your department chief about improving officer training." Not for punishment, for education. The taller officer blinked. "You'd do that for us?" "For everyone," he said simply. "You're not the only ones who need reminding." He picked up his suitcase again. Before leaving, he looked at them once more. "You can be good officers. Just remember, seeing someone as a threat before seeing them as a person is the first step toward failure." Then he walked out. The room stayed silent for a long moment after he left. The two officers just sat there, the weight of his words hanging in the air like something heavy and sacred. Outside, the man walked back toward the gate area. The terminal felt calmer now. People had mostly gone back to their own routines. A few still glanced at him, recognizing who he was, but he paid no attention. He found a small cafe near his gate and ordered a cup of coffee. The cashier's hands trembled slightly as she took his payment. "Sir, I just wanted to say, I saw what happened. That shouldn't have happened to you." He smiled faintly. "It shouldn't happen to anyone." She nodded, eyes soft with understanding. "You handled it with grace." He thanked her, took his coffee, and sat near the window again. He took a slow sip and let his mind wander. He thought about the job, about all the reports on community tension, all the debates about trust and authority. He had read so many words, seen so many graphs and statistics, but this small airport misunderstanding, had said more than any report could. Sometimes, he thought, people don't need punishment to learn. They need to face their reflection. He glanced at his watch. Still an hour before boarding. He decided to call his assistant, who picked up immediately. "Sir, are you all right?" "I just saw a news alert," he interrupted softly. "I'm fine. Tell the press team not to comment yet. We'll handle it internally." "Yes, sir." "The airport officials have already reached out to our office. They're panicking," he sighed. "That's expected. Let's not make it worse. I'll speak to the local chief myself." "Understood." He ended the call and leaned back in his seat, watching people move past. A little boy ran to the window, pressing his hands against the glass, laughing at the planes outside. His mother followed, smiling nervously. The man couldn't help but smile too. That innocence, free from judgment, free from suspicion, reminded him why his work mattered. A few minutes later, a man in a suit approached him. He looked nervous, like someone carrying bad news. "Sir," he said respectfully, "I'm the airport manager. I want to personally apologize for what happened today." The man shook his head. "There's no need to apologize again. I've already spoken to the officers." "Yes, sir, but—" He raised a hand kindly. "Use this as a chance to make things better. Train your people. Remind them that everyone deserves respect, no matter how they look or where they're from." The manager nodded, relieved. "We will, sir. Thank you for your understanding." After he left, the man took another sip of his coffee and stared out the window again. The sky was bright blue now, clouds drifting lazily above the runway. He could hear boarding calls echoing through the terminal. He didn't feel angry anymore, just thoughtful, deeply thoughtful. The moment would pass, but its lesson wouldn't. When it was time to board, he stood, collected his things, and walked toward the gate. The boarding agent recognized him immediately and gave a respectful nod. "Welcome aboard, sir," he smiled kindly. "Thank you." As he walked down the jet bridge, the cool air from outside brushed against his face. The hum of the airplane grew louder. He found his seat near the window and sat down. Through the small oval window, he saw the same two officers standing at a distance near the tarmac. They were talking quietly to another supervisor, heads lowered. For a moment, one of them looked up and met his gaze. The man nodded, not in anger, not in pride, but in silent forgiveness. The officer nodded back, eyes glassy with emotion. The engines started to roar. The plane began to move, slowly taxiing toward the runway. He watched as the ground beneath him shifted, the world outside growing smaller. He took one last deep breath and closed his eyes. Another day, another lesson, another reminder that respect once lost can always be taught again, but only if someone is willing to listen. And that morning, at a quiet airport, two officers had learned exactly that. The flight home was quiet. Most of the passengers were either sleeping or lost in their own thoughts. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin like distant thunder, steady and calming. He sat by the window, watching the clouds drift past, their shapes changing slowly in the sunlight. His mind, however, wasn't calm. The scene at the airport kept replaying. not as anger or frustration, but as a reminder. He had seen injustice before, in reports, in meetings, in investigations. But seeing it happen to himself, even in such a small moment, made everything feel more personal. It wasn't about ego. It was about what that moment represented. He thought of the two officers again. Their faces, the confusion, the arrogance, the regret, all of it told a bigger story. A story that didn't end with an apology. Change, he knew, didn't come from embarrassment. It came from awareness. The flight attendant stopped by his row and smiled politely. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" He blinked, realizing he had been lost in thought. "Just water, please." She handed him a small bottle and moved on. He unscrewed the cap and took a sip, his gaze still fixed on the clouds. He wondered how many people in the country went through similar things. People without badges, without titles, without anyone to recognize their worth when prejudice got in the way. That thought stayed with him for the rest of the flight. When the plane landed, the usual rush began, people standing too soon, grabbing bags from overhead bins, impatient to leave. He waited until the crowd cleared before standing up. He didn't like pushing or rushing. Patience was something he practiced like breathing. As he stepped out into the terminal of his home city, he was greeted by a familiar face, his driver, waiting quietly with a small smile. "Good morning, sir," the driver said. "Welcome back." "Thank you," he replied, shaking his hand. They walked together to the car outside. The air was cooler here, and the city skyline shimmered faintly in the distance. It felt good to be home. Once in the car, the driver started the engine. "Rough trip?" he asked casually. The man gave a quiet smile. "You could say that." "Learned a few things," the driver chuckled lightly. "You always do." He leaned back in his seat and looked out the window as the car merged onto the highway. The city passed by, bridges, billboards, people walking dogs, workers in uniforms. Life moving on as usual. His phone buzzed. A message from his assistant popped up. Chief of Airport Police requesting a meeting at noon. Local media asking for comment. He typed back a short reply, schedule the meeting. No press yet. He closed his eyes for a moment. He didn't want this to become a story about humiliation. He wanted it to be a story about learning. By noon, he arrived at the downtown headquarters of the local police department. It was an old brick building with tall windows and a flag waving proudly out front. The air inside smelled faintly of coffee and paper. A nervous-looking receptionist stood up immediately. "Sir, welcome. The chief is waiting for you upstairs." He nodded and followed her down the hall. The floorboards creaked slightly underfoot. When he entered the conference room, everyone stood. The chief, a man in his 50s with a serious face, extended his hand. "Sir, it's an honor. I can't tell you how sorry we are." The man shook his hand firmly. "Let's sit. We have things to discuss." The room fell silent. The chief began. "We've already spoken to the officers involved. They're deeply remorseful. They didn't recognize you and they made a bad call. We take full responsibility." He listened without interrupting. "I appreciate that," he said after a pause. "But I'm not here for apologies. I'm here for solutions." The chief nodded, looking relieved. "Absolutely. We've already drafted a proposal for additional bias training." He held up a hand. "Training is good, but that's not enough. This isn't just about your officers. It's about culture, about how we teach people to see others." The chief looked thoughtful. "What do you suggest?" He leaned forward slightly. "Start with humility. Officers need to understand that authority isn't power. It's service. Every time they stop someone, they're representing the entire system, and one bad moment can undo years of trust." The chief nodded again, taking notes. "You're right. We've lost touch with that sometimes." He continued, his voice calm but firm. "If your people see everyone as a suspect before they see them as a citizen, they've already failed." The chief sighed heavily. "You've given me a lot to think about." "Good," he said softly, "because thinking leads to change." The room stayed quiet for a moment. Then he added, "I'd also like to meet those officers again, privately." The chief hesitated. "Of course, sir." "Are you sure?" He nodded. "Yes. This isn't over for them until they understand what really went wrong." Within minutes, the two officers entered the room. Their faces were pale, eyes tired. They looked like they hadn't slept. The taller one spoke first, his voice low. "Sir, we want to apologize again." "We can't." He stopped him gently. I've already heard that. Sit down. They obeyed quietly. He looked at them both. Tell me something. When you woke up this morning, how did you feel? The taller officer looked embarrassed. Ashamed, sir? The other added softly, and afraid. He nodded. Good. Fear means you still care. Ashamed means you know what was wrong. They exchanged glances, not sure how to respond. He continued, but I don't want you to carry guilt forever. Guilt freezes people. What I want is understanding. Can you promise me that you'll treat every person you meet as if they matter, even when you're tired, even when you're frustrated? Both nodded earnestly. He leaned back, his tone softer now. This uniform you wear, and it doesn't make you better than anyone. It just gives you a bigger duty, to be fair. Remember that. The taller officer swallowed hard. We will, sir. He gave a small nod. Good. Then let this mistake be the start of something right. He stood up, shook their hands, and left the room. Outside, the chief caught up with him. Sir, I have to say, you handled that better than I could have imagined. He smiled faintly. You don't fix people by yelling at them. You fix them by showing them the mirror. The chief nodded slowly. I'll make sure that mirror stays up. He left the building, the cool afternoon air brushing his face. Reporters were waiting near the steps, cameras ready, microphones raised. Sir, is it true you were detained unfairly? One called out. Do you plan to file a complaint? Another shouted. He stopped for a moment, then said calmly, No complaint. Just a conversation. And I hope the world learns from it. Then he got into his car and closed the door. As they drove away, the driver looked at him in the rearview mirror. You really don't want to make it public? He shook his head. The goal isn't to destroy anyone's career. The goal is to build something better. The driver smiled faintly. You always take the long road. He smiled back. It's the only road that leads anywhere worth going. They drove in silence for a while. The city's noise faded behind them. He watched people on the sidewalks, workers, parents, students, all living their lives. Each one had their own story, their own struggles, their own dignity. That was the truth he had always believed in, that dignity wasn't earned by rank or title. It belonged to everyone equally. Later that evening, he sat alone in his study at home. The room was filled with soft light, the sound of a ticking clock in the background. On his desk lay a small notebook, one he kept for personal reflections. He opened it and wrote, Today reminded me that even those who protect the law can lose sight of justice. But maybe sometimes the best way to remind them isn't through punishment, but through patience. He closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair. Outside the window, the city lights sparkled against the dark sky. He thought of the two officers again, not as enemies, not as symbols, but as human beings who had stumbled. He smiled softly. Mistakes, when faced honestly, could be powerful teachers. And maybe, just maybe, something good would grow from this. He turned off the lamp and let the quiet of the night settle around him. Another day would come, another challenge, another chance to make the world a little better than it was yesterday. And for now, that was enough. The next morning started with a quiet knock on his office door. His assistant stepped in carefully, holding a folder and a cup of coffee. Good morning, sir, she said softly. You might want to see this. He looked up from his desk, taking the folder. Inside were several printed pages, news articles, social media screenshots, and online headlines. Even though he had asked for no public statement, the story had spread overnight. The headlines were everywhere. Airport officers detain FBI director by mistake. Top official faces bias at local airport. Calm reaction from director earns praise nationwide. He sighed, setting the papers aside. I told them not to push it to the press, he murmured. His assistant looked apologetic. It leaked, sir. Someone recorded part of the incident on their phone. The video's all over the internet. He nodded slowly, not angry, just thoughtful. That explains it, she hesitated. The public response isn't mixed. Some people are outraged. Others are praising how you handled it. You're trending online, he smiled faintly. That's not always a good thing. No, sir, she said carefully. But this time maybe it is. He leaned back in his chair, staring out the tall window behind his desk. The city skyline shimmered under the morning sun. He didn't care for attention or praise. What mattered to him was what came after the noise. What people learned when the headlines faded. Set up a meeting with our communications team, he said finally. If this story's out, We might as well use it to start a real conversation. Yes, sir. As she left the room, he picked up one of the printed pages again. The photo attached to the article showed him standing calmly in the airport, while the officers looked nervous. The caption read, "A lesson in grace and discipline." He didn't feel proud of that picture. To him, it was just a reminder of how much work still needed to be done, not just in one department, but everywhere. By noon, he walked into the conference room where his communications team was already waiting. The team members looked serious. Laptops open, notes spread across the table. One of them, a young woman with sharp eyes, spoke first. "Sir, the story's gone national. Major networks are reaching out for interviews. Everyone wants to hear your side." He sat down quietly. "My side is simple. I want this to be about awareness, not about me." She nodded. "We can shape that message. If you speak publicly, it could encourage departments across the country to rethink how they train their officers." He thought for a moment, then said, "Fine, but we'll keep it respectful. No anger, no blame. Just truth." "Understood," she said, typing quickly. They discussed tone, timing, and structure for the statement. He wanted his words to sound human, not political. Calm, but firm. He believed that real change didn't come from outrage. It came from reflection. Later that afternoon, he stood before a row of cameras in a small press briefing room. Dozens of reporters filled the seats, their microphones ready. Flashing lights clicked like steady rain. He waited for the noise to settle before speaking. "What happened to me at the airport," he began, "was not just about one mistake or two officers. It was a reflection of something deeper, something we've all seen in different forms." The room went silent. "I've worked in law enforcement my whole life. I've trained with good officers, honest, brave people who want to protect others. But I've also seen moments where fear and assumption take control. Those moments don't just hurt individuals. They weaken trust, and trust is the foundation of justice." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I don't want this story to become about humiliation or blame. I want it to be about growth, about realizing that even the best systems can make mistakes, and that what matters most is how we respond to them." The cameras kept flashing. "I believe in accountability. I also believe in forgiveness. We can have both, and we must if we want a safer, fairer country." He finished with a simple line. "Respect isn't a reward. It's a duty." Then he thanked the reporters and walked off the stage. The room buzzed with murmurs, but he didn't stay to hear them. He wasn't doing this for applause. He was doing it because words, when used right, could open doors that punishment alone never could. Back in his office, his assistant entered again, smiling faintly. "The press is calling your speech powerful, sir." He looked up from his chair. "Let's hope it becomes useful too," she nodded. "It already is. Departments from 3 states just requested copies of your statement. They want to use it for training." He exhaled softly, a rare smile forming. Then maybe something good came out of this after all. As evening approached, the office grew quieter. Most of his staff had gone home, leaving the building peaceful. He stayed behind, as he often did, reviewing reports and thinking about next steps. His phone buzzed again, a call from an unknown number. He answered. "Hello?" A hesitant voice came through. "Sir, it's one of the officers from the airport." He recognized the voice instantly. "Go on," he said. "I just wanted to thank you," the officer said quietly. "You could have ended our careers. But instead, you gave us a chance to fix ourselves. We've been talking about what happened. We want to do better." He listened silently, then replied, "That's what I hoped for. You can't change the past, but you can guide the next person who wears your badge." "Yes, sir," the officer said. "We'll remember that." After the call ended, he sat for a long time in silence. The room felt warmer somehow, not because of the light, but because of that small spark of understanding that had just been passed from one person to another. That night, he drove home himself, wanting the quiet of the open road. The city lights glimmered like distant stars as he passed them. He rolled down the window, letting the cool air in. The world felt different now, not calmer, not easier, but more connected. He thought of the thousands of people who had seen that video online, each forming their own opinions. Some angry, some inspired, some indifferent. He wondered how many of them would actually think deeper about what it meant, about how easy it was to misjudge someone, and how hard it was to undo that once it happened. When he reached home, He parked the car and sat for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel. His house lights glowed softly through the trees. He got out and walked up the path, the gravel crunching under his shoes. Inside, the quiet of his home wrapped around him like a blanket. He poured a glass of water and sat by the window. Outside, the moon hung low, silver light washing over the empty street. He thought again of those two officers. He didn't hate them, not for a second. He saw them as symbols of something bigger, of how ordinary people with authority and fear mixed together could make decisions that hurt others without even realizing it. But he also believed in redemption. Everyone deserved a second chance as long as they learned something real from the first mistake. He wrote another note in his notebook before bed. The hardest lesson to teach is empathy, but once it's learned, it changes everything. The next morning he woke early, as he always did. He made his own coffee, read the paper, and saw that his speech was still being discussed. Commentators were calling it measured, humble, and inspiring. He smiled quietly. The attention didn't matter. The message did. Later that day, he received an invitation from a national police academy. They wanted him to give a lecture about leadership and respect. He accepted immediately. If even a few young officers could learn something before making the same mistake, then it would be worth it. He looked out the window at the rising sun. A new day was beginning, filled with its own challenges, its own small lessons waiting to unfold, and for the first time in a while he felt something rare: peace. The following week began quietly, but the calm didn't last long. The story from the airport was still everywhere. Every news channel, social media platform, and talk show seemed to have something to say about it. People debated not just what had happened, but what it meant. Some called it a powerful example of patience and leadership. Others used it as proof of how deep bias could run, even in ordinary situations. Through it all, the man at the center of it stayed silent. He went to work, kept his routine, and focused on what mattered, building something good from the mess. One morning, while he was in a meeting with senior staff, his assistant came in with a message. "Sir," she said, "the local police chief from the airport district is asking to meet. He says it's important." He looked up from his notes, thoughtful. "Did he say why?" "No, sir. But I think it has to do with the two officers." He nodded slowly. "Set it up." The meeting was arranged for the next afternoon at his office. When the chief arrived, he looked nervous. His uniform was pressed, but his eyes were tired. He carried himself with the weight of someone who had been under pressure for days. "Thank you for seeing me, sir," the chief said, shaking his hand. "Of course," the director replied. "Please have a seat." The chief sat down and took a deep breath before speaking. "I want to apologize personally. What happened at that airport, it's something I can't defend. I've already opened an internal review and the two officers have been suspended pending retraining." The director listened quietly, not interrupting. The chief continued, "They're not bad people. They made a terrible mistake and they know it. They've been facing backlash from the public. Their families are getting threats. It's out of control." The director frowned slightly. "That's not what I wanted. I never asked for revenge. I wanted understanding." "I know," the chief said, "but the public doesn't always stop to listen." The room fell silent for a moment. The hum of the air conditioner filled the space. Finally, the director said, "What are you doing to fix it?" "We've started new training programs," the chief replied. "We're bringing in outside experts on communication and bias awareness. It's a start, but it's not enough. We need to change how we see people and not just how we treat them." The director nodded slowly. "You're right. Real change doesn't happen in classrooms. It happens in moments and when someone decides to act differently." The chief leaned forward. "If you're willing, I'd like to invite you to speak to our department, to help my officers understand what that moment felt like from your side." The director hesitated for a second, then said, "I'll do it." The chief looked surprised. "You will?" "Yes," he said simply. "If I can help even one of your officers think before judging, it's worth it." They shook hands again. And for the first time since the airport incident, both men felt something rare: progress. 2 days later, the director stood before a room full of uniformed officers. Some looked uneasy, others curious. The same two officers from the airport sat quietly in the front row. They couldn't meet his eyes at first. He began without notes or a script. "I know what you're thinking," he said. "You've all heard about what happened. Some of you might even think I came here to scold or embarrass you, but that's not why I'm here." He paused and looked around the room. "I came because I've been where you are. I've worn that same uniform. I've had to make quick decisions, sometimes with limited information. I know how hard your job is, but I also know this. Every time you stop someone, every time you question a traveler or talk to a stranger, you're not just enforcing laws. You're representing trust, and trust is fragile." The room was still. "When you break that trust," he continued softly, "you don't just hurt one person. You hurt everyone who believes in fairness. You make it harder for the next good officer who comes along." One of the officers from the airport raised his hand hesitantly. "Sir, I just want to say we're sorry. We didn't see who you were. The director interrupted gently. "You don't have to explain. I understand what you thought you were doing. What matters is what you do next." The officer nodded, his voice shaking a little. "We've been thinking about that every day since it happened. We want to be better." "That's where it starts," the director said. He spent the next hour talking with them, not lecturing, but sharing stories. He spoke about his early years in law enforcement, the mistakes he'd seen and the lessons that stayed with him. He told them how empathy could save lives, how patience could prevent tragedy, and how every uniform came with both power and responsibility. By the time he finished, the tension in the room had softened. Officers who had come in defensive now sat in quiet reflection. As the meeting ended, the chief thanked him again. "You did more in 1 hour than any training manual ever could." The director smiled faintly. "I just reminded them of what they already knew." That night, as he drove home, he felt lighter. Not happy exactly, but fulfilled. He had seen a small shift, a moment where understanding had replaced anger. That was enough for now. When he got home, the lights were low. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat near the window again. The city outside looked peaceful, almost unaware of the noise that had filled it just days ago. He thought about how strange life could be. One mistake at an airport had turned into a national discussion. It had brought both pain and possibility. He wondered if that was how real change happened, not through big speeches or policies, but through uncomfortable moments that forced people to look at themselves differently. A few days later, he received a small package at his office. Inside was a handwritten letter and a framed photo. It was from the two officers. The letter read, "We wanted to thank you again. After your visit, we've been volunteering at a youth center in our city. We're learning a lot from the kids there, about patience, about communication, and about respect. You gave us a chance to rebuild, and we won't waste it." He smiled as he read it, touched by the sincerity. The photo showed the two officers standing with a group of children, smiling wide. It wasn't just an apology, it was growth. He placed the photo on his shelf between his certificates and awards. To him, it meant more than any medal. Later that week, he was invited to a national leadership event. When he took the stage, people expected him to talk about power and responsibility. Instead, he spoke about humility. He told them how the strongest leaders were the ones who could stay calm in humiliation, how forgiveness could change more than anger ever could, and how small moments of kindness could ripple farther than punishment. As he spoke, the room stayed completely silent. People listened not just to his words, but to the honesty in his voice. When he finished, the audience stood and applauded. But even then, he didn't see it as victory. He saw it as a reminder that leadership wasn't about being untouchable, but about being real. After the event, he walked outside into the cool evening air. The city lights glimmered again, just as they had the night of the incident. But this time, everything felt different. He took a deep breath, feeling the quiet peace that only came after chaos. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. The world had seen his patience. The officers had learned their lesson. And maybe somewhere, someone watching the story online would think twice before judging another person too quickly. He smiled faintly and whispered to himself, "That's enough." Then he walked toward his car, the streetlights stretching long shadows behind him, the kind that follow but never weigh you down. The months after the airport incident passed quietly, but the echoes of that day never fully faded. The man often found himself thinking about it during small moments, while sipping coffee before sunrise, or during late nights at his desk when the city lights shimmered outside his window. The story had long stopped making headlines, but its message continued to ripple through places he had never been. Police departments, schools, and even private companies were using that event as an example in training sessions. They called it the airport lesson. He didn't like that name much, but he understood why it stuck. It was simple. It told people that even the most ordinary day could turn into a turning point. One morning, as he reviewed reports, his assistant came in with a warm smile. "Sir, there's a letter for you." Came from a small town in the Midwest. He looked up, curious. "Who's it from?" "A community center director," she said, handing him the envelope. He opened it carefully. Inside was a letter written in neat handwriting. "We watched your story in one of our community meetings. It helped us talk about respect, fear, and understanding. Some of our local officers and young people sat together for the first time and shared their experiences. It wasn't easy, but it was honest. Thank you for starting something real." He read it twice, feeling a quiet warmth in his chest. He placed the letter down and said softly, "That's worth more than all the awards in the world?" His assistant smiled. "It seems like your story has become bigger than you." He nodded. "Good, that's how it should be." Later that week, he was invited to a televised forum on leadership and empathy. He didn't usually like public appearances, but something about this one felt important. It wasn't about politics or policy. It was about humanity. When he arrived at the studio, the host greeted him warmly. "We're honored to have you here. The story you lived through touched millions." He smiled politely. "I'm glad if it made people think." The cameras rolled and the interview began. The host asked, "What went through your mind when those officers detained you?" He paused before answering. At first disbelief, then calm. "I've spent my whole life teaching others to stay composed under pressure. That day I had to live my own advice." The host leaned forward. "Were you angry?" He shook his head. Anger would have changed nothing. "What I felt was sadness. Not for me, but for what it showed. We still have so far to go in learning to see each other beyond appearances." The host nodded thoughtfully. "And yet you chose to forgive." "Yes," he said simply. "Because forgiveness teaches more than punishment ever could. Those officers will never forget what they did, but they'll also never forget the chance they were given to learn from it." The audience applauded quietly. After the show, a young man from the production crew approached him. "Sir, my father's a police officer. He told me your story changed how he sees people. He said, 'Everyone I stop has a story too.'" The director smiled warmly. "That's all I ever hoped for." That night back at home, he sat at his kitchen table reading through the day's emails. Many were from strangers thanking him for how he handled everything. But one stood out. It was from one of the officers from the airport. The message was short but heartfelt. "Sir, we just finished our first month volunteering full-time with a youth mentorship program. We talk to the kids about fairness, judgment, and choices. We tell them what we learned from that day. Thank you for giving us a reason to change." He read it slowly, smiling to himself. People could change. He had always believed that, but now he had proof. The next morning, he decided to take a break from his usual schedule. He drove out of the city, away from meetings and reports, heading toward a quiet lake about an hour away. It was a place he used to visit when he needed to think. Calm, open, and simple. When he arrived, the sun was low, painting the sky in soft orange and gold. The water was still, reflecting every cloud above it. He walked along the wooden pier, listening to the faint sounds of birds and the gentle splash of waves. He took a deep breath and sat down at the edge, his shoes hanging just above the water. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly at peace. He thought about everything that had happened since that day. The confusion, the embarrassment, the headlines, the speeches, and the letters. It all felt like a long, winding road that had led to something simple but powerful: understanding. He had seen firsthand how one painful moment could become a lesson for an entire nation. It wasn't the way he would have chosen to teach it, but maybe that was how life worked, through surprises, even the uncomfortable ones. As the wind brushed past him, he remembered the words he had said to those officers. Respect isn't a reward, it's a duty. He realized those words weren't just for them, they were for everyone, himself included. Respect wasn't something you earned once and kept forever. It was something you had to practice every day, with patience, with humility, with grace. After a while, he stood up and started walking back to his car. A few people nearby recognized him and waved. They didn't ask for photos or autographs, just a quiet wave of appreciation. That felt right. When he returned to his office the next day, he was met with another surprise. His team had organized a small ceremony. Nothing grand, just close colleagues, staff members, and friends. One of them stood up to speak. "We wanted to thank you for showing the country what leadership really means. Not power, not pride, but humanity." He smiled, a little embarrassed by the attention. "You didn't have to do this." "We wanted to," his assistant said gently. "Because you reminded us all of something simple, that staying calm and kind doesn't make you weak. It makes you strong." He nodded, his eyes softening. "Thank you. But remember, it's not about me. It's about the message. We all have a role to play in making this world more decent." The room filled with quiet applause. That evening, when everyone had gone home, he stood by the window once more, looking out at the lights of the city. He thought about how much had changed, not just in his own life, but in the hearts of many people who had watched that simple story unfold. He picked up the framed photo of the two officers and the children from his shelf. For a moment, he just looked at it, the smiling faces, the sunlight, the hope. He whispered to himself, "This is what real victory looks like." As the night deepened, he wrote one last note in his journal. "We can't control how the world sees us, but we can control how we respond. Calm doesn't mean silence. Kindness doesn't mean weakness. Change begins the moment we choose to stay human." He closed the journal, feeling a quiet sense of closure. The world outside kept moving, cars passing, lights blinking, people living their own stories. But for him, something had settled inside. He had faced humiliation without anger. He had turned judgment into learning. And in doing so, he had reminded countless others that leadership was never about rank. It was about heart. As he turned off the lights and prepared to leave, he took one last look around his office, the papers, the photos, the framed letters from strangers. Each one told a small part of the journey. He smiled softly, locked the door, and walked down the hallway. The sound of his footsteps echoed gently against the polished floor. Outside, the air was cool and clear. The moon hung high, lighting his path. He took a deep breath and walked toward his car, not as a man of authority, not as a victim, but as someone who had lived through something that changed him. And through him, changed others too. He didn't need applause or headlines anymore. The real reward was invisible, living proof that even the hardest moments could lead to light if faced with patience and grace. And as he drove away into the quiet night, his mind was peaceful. The world would move on as it always did, but the lesson would stay. A story retold in classrooms, in training halls, and around dinner tables, reminding people of one simple truth: respect costs nothing, but it changes everything.